Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a world where silence was deadlier than gunfire, where an empire still dressed its wounds in medals and called it pride. In the summer of 1944, German soldiers on the Eastern Front woke to a morning so still, they thought the war had passed them by. They brewed coffee, mended boots, and joked about home, never knowing that 1 million Soviet soldiers were already crawling toward them through the mist. Within hours, whole divisions would cease to exist. Trenches would fill faster than they could be dug. Commanders would vanish mid-sentence, their orders swallowed by artillery smoke. This isn't a story of tactics or triumph. It's about what it feels like to serve a dying empire, to watch your world collapse, not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding sound of steel through flesh. If you want the kind of history that doesn't flinch, hit like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me, what would you have done if the dawn itself was the enemy now? Steady your breath, because you're about to witness the morning that buried an army alive. You are there, standing on the edge of a field in Belarus, on this particular morning. June 22nd, 1944. The air is still cool, even as the first hesitant rays of dawn begin to push through a thin, ethereal mist that clings to the low-lying ground. It's a morning like so many others you have known in this endless war. Yet, there is a quality to this silence, a deep, unsettling stillness that wraps around you. You expect another quiet patrol, the mundane rhythm of a front line that has seemed to settle into a kind of weary peace. The earth beneath your worn boots is damp, softened by the night's cool breath, and the air itself carries the scent of damp soil, distant pine, and the faint, acrid whisper of 1,000 forgotten battles. Listen closely. You hear them, don't you? The tiny, vibrant songs of birds, carried on a breeze that feels almost too gentle for this place. Their melodies drift carelessly over fields where the dew still clings to frosted mines. Each one a silent guardian of an unspoken promise of death, glittering faintly in the nascent light like sinister jewels. And the wind, it hums a low, ceaseless tune against the taut, cold strands of barbed wire, a sound that could almost lull you into a false sense of peace. It's a quiet that feels fragile, a tranquility that whispers of secrets hidden just beneath the surface, a calm so profound it almost feels like a deception. You breathe it in, this strangely pure air, and for a moment, you might forget where you are, might forget the weight of the war, the distant echoes of struggle that usually cling to the edges of your awareness. But the barbed wire, ever present, a silent, metallic harp, reminds you of the invisible cage that has become your world. You and the men around you believe the front here is calm. The reports from Berlin, whispered among officers, assure you that Soviet attention is fixed far to the south, thousands of miles away, perhaps near the distant, sun-baked plains of Ukraine. Here, in this forgotten corner of Belarus, there is only the routine, the monotonous vigil. Veterans of Stalingrad, men whose eyes hold the ghost of frostbite and starvation, and those who survived the steel inferno of Kursk, warm their hands over makeshift tin stoves. They trade stories of survival, their voices low, their faces etched with lines that speak of horrors no words can truly capture. You watch them, these survivors, these weary warriors, and a strange sense of quiet hope settles over you. just perhaps, this sector will remain untouched. Only a few miles away, hidden from your sight by the mist in the dense forest, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops wait. They are unseen, unheard. A vast, silent ocean of intent gathered in the darkness, breathing in unison, their presence a palpable weight on the unsuspecting land. Can you feel it? That subtle tremor beneath the earth? A distant rumble of engines that rolls through the fog like the low pulse of a coming storm, almost imperceptible against the gentle hum of the wind. It's the kind of sound that, in your weariness, you might mistake for a passing cloud or the shifting of the earth itself, rather than the gathering might of an army. 3 years to the day, this dawn, since Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union began. 3 years since a dream of swift conquest began to unravel into this slow, agonizing retreat. The Empire's reckoning, unspoken and unacknowledged, is about to begin. The wind, ever present, ever observant, brushes over the desolate trenches where you stand. A silent messenger. It whispers a chill against your cheek, a warning you cannot comprehend, a premonition that perhaps, just perhaps, this will be the last sunrise you will ever see in this fragile, deceptive peace. You can almost trace the lines of weariness on the map, the scars of a war that has turned against you. After the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht's boundless confidence, once as sharp and gleaming as a newly forged bayonet, shattered into a million icy fragments. Victory, that once intoxicating word, became nothing more than a hollow rumor, recycled by propaganda broadcasts that played over scratchy radios, trying desperately to inject a false bravado into the tired hearts of men. You heard those broadcasts, didn't you? You felt the emptiness behind the triumphant words, the stark contrast with the mud and the hunger that had become your constant companions. Then came Kursk, the summer of the previous year, a cauldron where the grand dreams of Blitzkrieg finally met their fiery end. Imagine, if you can, the sheer scale of it, more than 3,000 tanks. The pride of the German war machine, burned, their hulks, twisted and blackened, became silent monuments to a lost cause, forever scarring the landscape. Each sunrise over those burned tanks marked the slow, agonizing fading of the Third Reich's light, a flickering flame against an encroaching darkness. And after that, the war changed for you. No longer were you charging forward, spearheading lightning advances across vast plains. Now, your hands knew the familiar ache of digging, of shoveling cold earth, creating trenches that offered only a temporary, flimsy shelter, never a path forward. You slept in the mud, sometimes so cold it felt as if your bones would shatter. And you woke to the persistent, gnawing specters of hunger and exhaustion that clung to you like a second skin. Far from the mud and the blood of the Eastern Front, in his distant bunkers, Hitler himself seemed to turn away from the reality of this slow decay. His obsession, a strange, desperate fixation, shifted to the Balkan oil fields, believing them to be the very veins of his dying war machine. He poured all remaining reserves, precious tanks, dwindling fuel, and even fresh, young men who had seen too little of life. Southward, this desperate gamble, this last throw of the dice, left the vast expanse of Army Group Center, the very forces you are part of here in Belarus, exposed. A gaping wound in the heart of the Eastern defense, left vulnerable, almost forgotten. Your commanders, far removed from the cold reality of your trenches, still sent assurances back to Berlin. You can almost hear their confident pronouncements echoing through the distant hallways of power. The Central Front, they declared, was too stable to collapse. A comforting lie, a whisper of false hope, meant to soothe a paranoid dictator. Yet, in Moscow, in the austere, watchful chambers of Stalin and his Stavka, that same safe sector, the very ground you stand upon was marked as the heart to strike, the soft underbelly of an overstretched, deluded empire. They saw what your own high command refused to acknowledge. The empire that once stormed across over 1,200 miles in a mere 6 months, that once seemed invincible in its relentless drive, now trembled. It trembled behind mere strands of barbed wire. Its strength drained, its spirit fractured. You feel that tremor, don't you? It's not just the earth. It's the very ground beneath your feet, vibrating with a silent, unseen tension, a premonition of the colossal force that is about to descend. Each sunrise, tinged with the memory of the burned tanks, becomes a reminder of a grand ambition, fading into the gray anonymity of defeat, leaving you here, caught in the twilight of a dying dream. Imagine, if you will, a magician's trick on a scale so vast it encompasses entire battlefields. In the early months of 1944, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift began to unfold. A profound act of illusion that would seal your fate. The Soviets launched a deception campaign, a masterstroke known as maskirovka, a word that simply means camouflage, yet suggests something far more intricate, more profound than mere concealment. It was an art, really, half truth, half shadow, meticulously crafted to lull the giants of the German High Command into a fatal slumber. You wouldn't have seen it directly, not from your position, but you might have heard whispers, or perhaps seen a faint, puzzling report on a captured document. Dummy camps, like phantom cities and fake tank formations, crafted from wood and canvas, began to sprout across the southern front. Imagine acres of empty fields suddenly blossoming with these ghostly armies, their silhouettes convincing enough to fool the hurried eye, or the distant lens of a reconnaissance plane. They were mere phantoms, yet their presence was meticulously designed to feel utterly real, a mirage shimmering in the summer heat. Real armored units, the very iron beasts that would soon tear through your lines, played their part in this grand theatrical performance. By day, they would parade south, their engines rumbling, their treads churning up the dust, a clear, unmistakable sign of a powerful force moving towards the Ukraine. And then, as night fell, as the stars began to pinprick the dark canvas of the sky, these same units would turn. Under the velvet shroud of darkness, they would roll back north, their movements concealed, their very presence dissolving into the shadows, only to repeat the charade the next day, a rhythmic, hypnotic dance of deception. Empty fields, where only the wind once whispered secrets, now became forests of wooden tanks and fabric tents. The very landscape seemed to conspire against you, shifting and transforming under the Soviet hand. And the Luftwaffe, your eyes in the sky, flew overhead. Their reconnaissance pilots, confident in their superior vision, reported back to Berlin of a massive buildup in Ukraine. They saw exactly what Stalin intended them to see: their reports confirming the grand illusion, solidifying the lie into what seemed an undeniable truth within the halls of German intelligence. What made this deception so potent, so insidious, was that it was woven with strands of truth. At the very same time, a genuine offensive, a real and brutal strike, was planned in Ukraine. This was the genius of Maskirovka, a lie so convincing because it contained the seeds of truth. The Southern Front was a target, making the false intelligence ring with an undeniable authenticity. Meanwhile, as your attention was drawn southward, away from your quiet sector, real assault divisions, the instruments of your undoing, quietly boarded night trains to Belarus. Their wheels, you wouldn't believe it, were wrapped in cloth, their metallic grind muffled into a soft whisper against the rails. Not a single light, not even the smallest spark, was allowed to shine from those trains as they carried their deadly cargo north, closer and closer to your unsuspecting lines. By June, the German High Command, having completely, utterly deceived, all your strength, all your precious reserves, shifted hundreds of miles away, leaving you here, vulnerable, waiting in the quiet, for a storm you never saw coming. The summer of 1944 was not just a season of sun and lengthening days for you. It was a silent prelude to an unimaginable gathering. While your weary eyes watched the quiet Belarusian fields, a colossal force was coalescing in the shadows, a tide of humanity and steel preparing to break. Over 1.6 million men, a number so vast it almost defies comprehension, stood ready. Imagine the sheer weight of their presence, the low, collective hum of their anticipation, and with them, a forest of 32,000 guns. Each one a silent promise of thunder, aimed directly at your positions. The ground itself seemed to wait, laden with the expectation of their coming. Then, the machines of war, 800 tanks, their armored hides camouflaged, their engines ready to roar, and an additional 800 aircraft, poised to darken the skies, their wings a grim shadow of the fate awaiting you. This wasn't just a force. It was a world, an entire industrial might focused with deadly precision on one single point. But the storm wasn't just physical. It was a deep, pervasive network of sabotage and disruption. You might have noticed small things, subtle signs of unrest beyond your immediate front. Belarusian partisans, ghosts in the forest, and the Polish resistance, tenacious and fierce, were already at work. They sabotaged railways, cutting the lifelines of supply that might have brought you food or ammunition. They severed fuel lines, leaving your precious vehicles stranded, hungry for the very essence of their power. These were the unseen hands, the quiet saboteurs, preparing the ground for the deluge. Soviet reconnaissance, patient and meticulous, had mapped every trench you dug, every gun pit, every bunker you sought shelter in. They knew the contours of your meager defenses better than you did yourself. Each detail a whisper carried back to their waiting commanders. T-34 divisions, the very heart of the Red Army's armor, lay hidden beneath the dense canopies of the forest, their steel bodies draped in hay and mud, blending seamlessly with the earth. You walked past them unknowingly, these steel beasts, dormant and unseen, waiting for their moment. You, the German soldiers, felt the gnawing emptiness. You lacked food, the rations dwindling to a meager existence. You lacked fuel, your precious vehicles often sitting idle, helpless. And perhaps most painfully, you lacked faith, that burning conviction that had once propelled you forward. Now, you clung to the minefields you had laid, not as a strategic barrier, but almost like a charm against fate, a desperate hope that these silent guardians might somehow protect you from the inevitable. You reported back to Berlin, your voices weary, your messages echoing the quiet of your sector, all quiet on the Central Front. A tragic irony, an unwitting lie. Yet, subtle changes were already in the air, if you had only known what to listen for. Soviet radio jammers began to hum, a low, persistent thrumming, an invisible curtain drawing itself across the airwaves. This was the silent signal, the prelude to the strike, isolating you from the very world that might have warned you. And then, on the night of June 21st, as the last sliver of twilight faded into utter darkness, red flares streaked into the sky. Not one, not two, but dozens, arcing silently against the blackness like terrible stars, illuminating nothing but the cold dread in the hearts of those who understood their meaning. It was the storm's heartbeat, slow and deliberate, marking the final moments before the deluge. You, tired and oblivious, fell asleep to the sound of the wind, unaware that by dawn, your world would be gone. The quiet dawn you had known, the false peace you had clung to, shattered with an unimaginable fury. At 3 Darzurbaham, precisely as the last vestiges of night were beginning to yield to the first faint stirrings of morning, the sky erupted. It was not a gradual crescendo, but an instantaneous, overwhelming roar. Thousands of Soviet guns, meticulously positioned, patiently waiting, thundered as one, a singular, deafening voice of destruction. The sound, a primal bellow, ripped through the air, shaking the very ground beneath your feet, vibrating through your bones, a shock wave that stole your breath and stole the silence forever. Shells rained across the German lines, not individually, but in a continuous, terrifying deluge. They tore the earth open for miles, a ceaseless barrage that turned the quiet fields and forests into a churning landscape of fire, smoke, and flying debris. You stumbled out of your bunkers, disoriented, bewildered, into a world transformed. The air, once damp and cool, now tasted of metal and dust, thick with the acrid scent of high explosives, burning earth, and the faint, horrifying tang of fear. Every breath was a struggle against the choking reality of the inferno that had consumed your world. To the north, the ancient city of Vitebsk, a strategic anchor in your defenses, became the first target. Soviet bombers, unseen until now, descended from the pre-dawn darkness, their payloads flattening the entrenched artillery network, silencing your guns before they even had a chance to reply. The earth around Vitebsk groaned under the weight of the bombardment, swallowed by a storm of fire and steel. As the smoke still billowed, the T-34s, those armored juggernauts, began to roll forward. These were not ordinary tanks. Some were specialized mine-clearing machines, designed to crush the defenses you had so painstakingly laid, clearing a path through the obstacles like an unstoppable, metallic tide. You watched, helpless, as they devoured your lines, rendering your carefully planned fortifications utterly meaningless. Behind them, waves of Soviet infantry surged through the breaches, their red flags, symbols of a relentless resolve, held high, a terrifying tide of humanity. Their advance was not a cautious probe, but a determined, overwhelming surge, pushing through the chaos and destruction, their momentum unstoppable. Within just 72 hours, the German 53rd Corps, a force of 30,000 men, once considered robust and vital, found itself completely surrounded. The pincers had closed, slowly, inexorably, trapping them in a tightening noose. Hope, if it had ever flickered, began to die a quick, agonizing death. From distant headquarters, Hitler's voice, devoid of empathy, echoed orders that sealed their doom. He forbade withdrawal. "Stand and die," he commanded, a decree of sacrifice delivered from the safety of his bunker. By June 25th, just 3 days after the thunder broke, Vitebsk was gone. The northern wall of Army Group Center, a linchpin of your defense, had fallen, swallowed into a profound and terrible silence. You felt the chill of that silence, didn't you? The sudden, unsettling absence of sound, where once there had been the desperate chatter of men, now replaced by the ringing in your ears. A silent testament to the devastating force that had just torn through your world. As the northern front buckled and fell, your empire's fate was also being decided in the south. A story unfolding in tandem, equally grim. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, a name that would soon be etched in the annals of this brutal war, commanded the second pincer of this vast operation. His target the city of Bobruisk, a vital junction, a strategic heart in the sprawling network of Belarus. You could almost feel the weight of his strategic intent, the relentless drive of his forces, even from afar. Your commanders, in a desperate attempt to stem the tide, redeployed German armor, the remaining steel giants of the Wehrmacht, to block his advance. But this land, this ancient, unforgiving land, conspired against them. The Pripyat marshes, vast and treacherous, swallowed the panzers whole. Imagine the sight: these mighty tanks, designed for speed and power, slowly, inexorably sinking into the viscous mud. Their tracks, meant to propel them across any terrain, instead churned uselessly, digging them deeper into the earth's soft, suffocating embrace. Crews, in their desperation, abandoned their magnificent machines, leaving them to the bog, fleeing on foot, their heavy boots sucking at the mire, their faces etched with despair. The mud consumed the machines and the last vestiges of hope, leaving a silent graveyard of steel. Rokossovsky, sensing the profound weakness, sensing the victory, advanced almost unopposed. "No resistance of note," he wrote in his dispatches, a chilling understatement that belied the utter collapse of an entire defensive line. His forces rolled forward, gaining momentum with every stride, pushing deeper into the exposed flank of Army Group Center. Meanwhile, another front, a relentless hammer, attacked Mogilev, further east, with the grim purpose of trapping the German Fourth Army, sealing their fate. The days blurred into a relentless procession of defeats. On June 28th, Mogilev, a city that had stood firm for so long, fell. Its defenses crumbled, its spirit broken. And just a day later, on the 29th, Bobruisk followed, its fate sealed by Rokossovsky's relentless push. The reports, when they trickled through, spoke of unimaginable devastation: over 70,000 Germans killed or captured, their lives extinguished or their freedom lost in the span of mere days. The southern wall, the last hope of a cohesive defense, collapsed entirely. 7 days. That's all it took. 7 days for the entire central defense of the Eastern Front to disintegrate, to dissolve into a chaos of retreat and annihilation. You hear the whispers among the men, the grim designation that spread like wildfire, Die Schwarze Woche, the Black Week, a week that would forever mark the turning point, a week that saw an empire's dreams turn to ashes. You feel the chill of that week, don't you? A cold dread that settles deep in your bones, a heavy blanket of despair that seems to muffle all sound, leaving only the quiet, terrifying echo of an empire in full collapse. The next target, a pulsing heart in the dying body of your empire's defense, was Minsk. Minsk, the capital of Belarus, the very center of the German line. A strategic prize of immense significance. You could almost hear the distant, growing rumble of the Soviet advance, a relentless tide surging westward, leaving destruction in its wake. The desperate urgency of the situation forced changes, even in the highest echelons of command. Hitler, in a rare moment of reluctant pragmatism, replaced the beleaguered Field Marshal Ernst Busch with Walter Model, his so-called fireman of the Reich model. Known for his stubborn defense and his ability to temporarily halt Soviet advances, was thrown into this inferno, a last, desperate hope. Model, seeing the catastrophe unfolding, ordered an immediate withdrawal, a desperate attempt to salvage what little remained. He worked tirelessly, rallying the shattered survivors, trying to weave a semblance of order from the chaos, and summoning the legendary 5th Panzer Division. Their pride and their power lay in their Tiger tanks, monstrous machines of war. Their thick armor and potent guns, a symbol of German engineering prowess. They roared towards Minsk, a desperate race against time, their engines straining, their treads tearing through the ravaged landscape. But even these formidable machines could not escape the omnipresent threat from above. Soviet bombers, their numbers seemingly endless, attacked relentlessly en route, pounding the columns, turning the roads into fiery gauntlets. Only 18 Tigers, out of a much larger force, managed to claw their way into the beleaguered city of Minsk. 18 steel behemoths, now fighting like cornered beasts, their crews pushing them to their limits. You can almost hear their desperate roars, the thunder of their guns as they tore through Soviet armor, inflicting heavy losses, trying to buy precious hours, precious minutes for their comrades. But the skies above belonged to the Soviets. Air superiority, absolute and devastating, combined with the crushing reality of fuel shortages, doomed them, one by one. Their hulks smoldered by July 2nd, silent testament to a valiant, but ultimately futile, stand. Their fires, dying slowly in the humid air, were the funeral pyres of a grand, desperate hope. The Soviet pincers, relentlessly closing, converged from both north and south, like the jaws of a monstrous trap. They met on July 3rd, sealing the fate of Minsk. The city became encircled, a pocket of desperate resistance, a last isolated outpost of a collapsing front. The sky above Minsk burned red with tracer fire, a macabre fireworks display illuminating the terrible beauty of utter destruction. The rhythmic thud of artillery, the crackle of small arms, the distant explosions, all of it a symphony of obliteration. The beating heart of Army Group Center, the very nerve center of your forces in this region, stopped here. It stopped in ashes and smoke, in the rubble of once proud building, amidst the despair of trapped men. You can almost feel the cessation, the abrupt silence after the clamor, the final, agonizing expiration of a vast and complex military organism. The silence that follows is not peaceful. It is the silence of death, cold and absolute, hanging heavy over the ruined city. The final act of the tragedy was now playing out in the shattered confines of the Minsk pocket. Imagine, if you can, the terror and despair of 100,000 German troops trapped inside. A vast number, a veritable army, now cut off, isolated, left to their own devices in a tightening hell. Their ammunition, once precious, now completely gone. Their rifles and machine guns mere useless weight. Food, that most basic necessity, vanished, leaving the gnawing emptiness of hunger to join the ever-present fear. Command lines, those invisible threads that connected them to the wider world, were silent, severed. There was no hope of relief, no whisper of rescue. Only fear remained, a cold, pervasive entity that clung to every man. Soviet artillery, relentless and merciless, shelled the city day and night. It was a ceaseless, grinding torment, turning the once proud city to dust, reducing buildings to rubble, streets to impassable barricades of debris. You could almost feel the vibrations of each impact, even from a distance, a constant tremor in the earth, a rhythm of destruction that hammered home the utter futility of resistance. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the stench of burning, a suffocating blanket of despair. On July 4th, as the dawn broke over the smoking ruins, Minsk fell completely. The last pockets of resistance were crushed, the last desperate stands silenced. General Vinzenz Müller, a man burdened with the command of what little remained, was captured amidst the chaos. In a final, agonizing decision, he issued the order to surrender, a directive that must have felt like a blade through his own heart. For many, it was a moment of bitter relief, the end of an unbearable nightmare. For others, it was the final, crushing humiliation. 60,000 men, the gaunt survivors, marched into captivity, their faces hollow, their spirit broken, a long, shuffling column of defeated humanity. They were living specters, a testament to the savagery they had endured. The rest, tens of thousands more, lay scattered among the ruins, their lives extinguished, their bodies mingling with the dust and debris of the devastated city. The sheer scale of the loss is staggering. 25 divisions, entire formations, meticulously trained and equipped, simply ceased to exist. Army Group Center, a formidable force just weeks before, was annihilated, wiped from the map of war. Soviet war diaries, with a chilling detachment, recorded the grim aftermath. We met no enemy, only ghosts. You can feel the truth in that phrase, the profound emptiness it describes. The forests around Minsk, once places of refuge and concealment, now reeked. They reeked of oil, rust, and death. A sickly, metallic sweet odor that hung heavy in the humid summer air. It was the smell of an empire's corpse, decaying slowly under the indifferent sun. A stark, visceral reminder of the terrible price of war and the swift, brutal end of a once powerful dream. The fall of Minsk was not an end, but a terrifying new beginning for your shrinking empire. The Soviet advance, a red tide that seemed to gather strength with every mile, surged westward, relentless and unstoppable, like a colossal wave. It rolled into Poland, into Lithuania, into Latvia, each liberated territory marking a new scar on the retreating German lines. You could almost feel the momentum, the unstoppable force of this renewed Red Army, pushing ever onward. To the north, their forces pressed deep into the Baltic states. They captured Šiauliai on July 27th, a significant victory, a strategic stepping stone. Then, with terrifying speed, they reached the Gulf of Riga on July 31st. This was a critical blow, a severing of vital arteries, effectively cutting off Army Group North, trapping them, isolating them in the distant Baltic pocket, leaving them to their own desperate fate. The northern flank of your defenses was now not merely pushed back, but profoundly fractured, its very existence threatened. In the center, the forces that had shattered Army Group Center continued their relentless drive. They seized Vilnius, the historic capital of Lithuania, expelling German forces from the region, pushing them further and further west. Białystok, another key city, fell, marking the steady erosion of your presence in these lands. Each captured town, each liberated village, was a step closer to the very heart of the Reich, a testament to the incredible speed and power of the Soviet offensive. To the south, new offensives, launched across Ukraine, exerted immense pressure. These strategic moves had far-reaching consequences, causing your weary Axis allies to falter, Romania and Bulgaria, sensing the inevitable and facing the grim reality of the advancing Red Army, began to defect from the Axis, seeking to salvage what they could from the ruins of their alliance. The grand design of Hitler's European empire was unraveling, piece by agonizing piece. In an astonishing 6 weeks, the Red Army advanced over 340 miles, a feat of logistics and sheer human will that defied belief. They reached the Vistula River, a major geographical barrier near Warsaw, the Polish capital. Your remaining German defenders, desperate and depleted, tried to hold the line at the Vistula, attempting to establish a new, final defensive position. But their efforts were crushed, their desperate stands overwhelmed in the Lublin-Brest offensive. Another 100,000 Germans, men who had survived so much, were killed or captured. Adding to the staggering casualty lists, the Eastern Front, once a vast, continuous line of battle, now existed only as a fractured scar of retreat, a series of desperate pockets and isolated stands. By late summer, the long, cold shadow of the Red Army loomed, menacing and inevitable, over the Polish capital itself, a harbinger of the final, bloody chapters of the war. The summer of 1944 reached its climax not with a battle, but with a plea and a betrayal. On August 1st, 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began. You can almost feel the tremor of hope that surged through the streets of the Polish capital. Civilians, weary of occupation, believing the relentless Soviet advance would surely bring them liberation, rose up, armed with courage and a desperate hope for freedom. They fought fiercely, believing their Red Army liberators were just across the river, ready to sweep in and save them. But the Red Army halted. Its vast columns, its tanks, its artillery stopped. From exhaustion, perhaps. The immense logistical strain of such a rapid advance had surely taken its toll. Or perhaps. And this is the chilling whisper that lingers. It was politics. A deliberate pause, allowing your forces to do the Soviets' dirty work. German reinforcements, pulled from the relative quiet of the Italian front, arrived in Warsaw, brutal and efficient. They crushed the revolt with fire and iron, turning the city into a pyre. Warsaw burned for weeks, its magnificent architecture consumed by the flames, its ruins glowing red under the cold autumn rain. A city bled, its people slaughtered, while salvation waited just beyond the Vistula. A silent, unforgiving witness. Meanwhile, far away in Moscow, a chilling spectacle unfolded. 57,000 German prisoners, the remnants of Army Group Center, were paraded through the streets. A Roman triumph in the 20th century. A silent, humiliating procession of the defeated. The citizens of Moscow watched in silence, their faces grim, their eyes reflecting not joy or cheering, but a cold, hard satisfaction. Victory, for them, had no cheer. It had only the grim, unyielding taste of retribution. The losses for your empire were staggering, beyond what the early days of the war could have ever conceived. German casualties exceeded 400,000 men, a number so vast it represented an entire fighting force. 25 divisions, once the backbone of the Eastern Front, were erased from existence. But the cost was immense for everyone. The Soviets, too, paid a terrible price for their destiny, losing 180,000 dead and 500,000 wounded. Their lives forever altered or ended in this brutal campaign. Yet, Operation Bagration, in its ferocity and its scale, changed everything. From this moment, this turning point, Berlin, the heart of your empire, lay within reach. No longer an unreachable dream, but a tangible, terrifying reality. As night falls once more over the fields of Belarus, the wind hums through the wrecks of Tiger tanks, their steel bodies now twisted, rusted, and silent. They are mere relics of a dream that died in its sleep, shattered by a dawn that brought not peace, but the full, terrible reckoning of a world collapsing around you. And still, the wind whispers, carrying the echoes of what was and what now will never be again. Welcome, my fellow nocturnal historians, to a quiet journey back in time, as the world outside settles into slumber, and the gentle hush of night enfolds us. Make yourself comfortable. We're embarking on a tranquil voyage into one of history's most tumultuous, yet often misunderstood chapters: the birth of the Soviet Empire from the ashes of Imperial Russia. This is a period of profound chaos, desperate hopes, and brutal realities, painted not in Hollywood's dramatic strokes, but in the nuanced, somber hues of lived experience. While revolution often conjures images of immediate, decisive action, Russia's great unraveling was a slow, agonizing process, a symphony of suffering and struggle echoing through millions of lives. If you find solace in these whispered forays into yesteryear, consider subscribing, so you never miss another tranquil journey. Now, let your breath grow slow and even, and allow the stories of an empire's twilight to unfold around you. Listen closely, for the wind over the Neva whispers tales of grand palaces and desolate plains, of despair and a strange, unyielding resolve. Imagine, if you will, the profound silence of a Russian midnight, the kind that settles heavy and cold over the ancient city of Petrograd. We drift back to a time of monumental upheaval, to the very heart of an empire in its final, shuddering breaths. The Winter Palace. For centuries, a majestic symbol of unyielding power and breathtaking splendor, its gilded halls accustomed only to the soft rustle of silk and the gentle murmur of courtly intrigue, now stood transformed. Within its vast, ornate chambers were countless chandeliers like frozen cascades of light, once shimmered with imperial glory. Now only a nervous, uncertain flicker remained. Each fragile flame seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of a dying era. And through these marble halls, designed to amplify whispers, there now reverberated the stark, chilling echoes of rifle fire. Sharp, insistent cracks that pierced the stillness and spoke of a new, brutal reality. It was no longer a palace, but a besieged fortress, its grand entrances choked with hastily erected barricades, its magnificent windows gazing out upon a city stirring with an unfamiliar, dangerous energy. A palpable sense of frantic panic, a cold dread, had replaced the centuries of imperial confidence, settling like a shroud over every statue, every tapestry, every shadow within those hallowed walls. It was in this atmosphere of simmering tension that the fateful signal came. From the cruiser Aurora, anchored like a metallic sentinel upon the dark waters of the Neva River, a single thunderous shot rent the night. Not a shell meant for destruction, but a blank round, a terrifying announcement. With that solitary boom, 3 centuries of Romanov monarchy, an imperial line that had stretched back across generations, began its inevitable, agonizing crumble. The sound echoed not just across the waterways and cobblestone streets of Petrograd, but across the vast, slumbering expanse of the Russian Empire itself. Beyond the immediate confines of the capital, the imperial landscape was already groaning under an unbearable weight. For untold millions of peasants, life had long been an endless cycle of toil and hardship, marked by crushing taxes that squeezed the very breath from their agrarian existence, and by the gnawing pangs of hunger that were all too familiar companions. Their suffering was not new, but it had reached a breaking point. Simultaneously, the seemingly endless carnage of World War I had bled Russia dry, extracting a toll that defied comprehension. Millions of its young men, once strong and vibrant, lay dead in the frozen fields and muddy trenches of the Eastern Front, their lives extinguished for a war few understood or believed in. And for those who remained, for the families struggling at home, starvation became a constant, terrifying specter. The fabric of society was stretched taut, frayed at every edge, ready to tear apart with the slightest provocation. The first whispers of the storm began not with a roar, but with a quiet desperation. On a specific Thursday, March 8th, 1917, a day soon to be etched into history, a procession of women began to march through the streets of Petrograd. They did not march for abstract ideals or political manifestos. They marched simply, tragically, for bread. Their cries, initially soft murmurs, quickly swelled into a powerful chorus that resonated through the frigid air. By nightfall, their desperate plea had ignited a city-wide conflagration. What began as a protest for sustenance transformed into a profound uprising, a furious wave of discontent sweeping through the very heart of the capital. The authorities, accustomed to quelling dissent with brute force, ordered soldiers to fire upon the surging crowds. Yet, in a chilling testament to the empire's terminal decline, something profoundly different happened. The soldiers, many of them peasants themselves, weary of war and sympathetic to the cries of their own people, refused. Their rifles remained silent. In that pivotal moment, their loyalty, once an unyielding cornerstone of the Tsar's power, dissolved like snowflakes upon the melting ground. It was a silent, powerful abdication of allegiance, more devastating than any physical assault, and so, quietly, almost imperceptibly, amidst the burgeoning chaos, Tsar Nicholas II, the last autocrat of all Russia, signed the document of his own undoing, his abdication, performed in a hushed railway car, brought an end to the Romanov line, not with the clash of swords or the thunder of cannons, but with a mournful silence. In that poignant moment, an empire that had stood for 3 centuries collapsed, not under the weight of a foreign invasion, but from within, devoured by its own internal contradictions and the crushing weight of its people's despair. Outside, the wind on the Neva, ever present and indifferent, seemed to whisper a new truth, a chilling elegy. The empire is dead. As the echoes of the Tsar's abdication faded into the vastness of the Russian winter, a profound void emerged. The removal of the monarchy, though widely welcomed, left behind not clarity, but a bewildering vacuum. Into this space, 2 distinct powers, like twin spirits battling for the soul of a dying nation, began to crystallize. On one side stood the provisional government, born of the old Duma's liberal members, speaking in measured tones of democratic ideals and a future built on parliamentary principles. They envisioned a Russia that would join the ranks of Western democracies, albeit after the brutal war had finally concluded. Yet, simultaneously, a far more radical and deeply rooted power was consolidating its influence, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. This council, a vibrant and often tumultuous assembly, claimed to speak directly for the heart of Russia, for the weary workers toiling in the factories and the disillusioned soldiers returning from the front. They represented the raw, visceral desires of the common people: peace, land, and bread. These 2 entities, the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet, shared the same broken body of a nation, yet their hearts beat to fundamentally different rhythms, pulling Russia in opposing directions. In a twist of fate that would prove decisive, the Soviet, despite not being the formal government, held the true levers of power. Through a decree known as Order Number 1, it had effectively gained control over the loyalty of the army, its vast network of railways, and the crucial telegraph lines that crisscrossed the empire. The provisional government might have occupied the grand offices of state, but the real authority, the ability to mobilize men and machines, lay firmly within the grasp of the Soviet. This duality, this fractured authority, created an unstable equilibrium, a precarious balance that could not, and would not, endure. Adding to this complex tapestry of power was the provisional government's unwavering and ultimately fatal insistence on continuing the war against Germany. They believed it was a matter of national honor and international obligation, a necessary step to secure Russia's place among the great powers. But for a populace bleeding, starving, and yearning for an end to the ceaseless bloodshed, this commitment felt like a cruel betrayal. The endless casualty lists, the crumbling economy, the sheer exhaustion had long stripped away any patriotic fervor for the conflict. It was amidst this swirling chaos, this profound disconnect between governance and the will of the people, that a figure of immense historical consequence reappeared. from the quiet solitude of exile in Switzerland, across the war-torn landscape of Europe. A thin man with eyes that seemed to burn with an almost feverish intensity returned to Petrograd. His name was Vladimir Lenin. His arrival, facilitated by the Germans who hoped he would destabilize Russia further, proved to be a pivotal moment. His words, delivered with a piercing clarity and an unyielding conviction, resonated deeply with the restless populace. "All power to the Soviets," he declared. A simple yet revolutionary slogan that cut through the ambiguity of dual power and offered a direct, radical solution to a people ravaged by war, tormented by hunger and yearning for respite. Lenin's promise of peace, land, and bread sounded holier, more urgent than the abstract ideals of freedom and democracy offered by the provisional government. His message was simple, direct, and met the immediate needs of the weary masses. Soon, the air of Petrograd, already thick with the smoke of revolutionary fervor, became filled with a vibrant cacophony of red flags, fervent chants, and the intoxicating promises of a new dawn. Yet, history teaches a harsh lesson: power is rarely shared willingly. It is a prize that must be seized, often through violent means. And in the shadows of this burgeoning revolution, among the ranks of the soldiers, a silent, grim process had begun. They were choosing sides, and the fate of Russia hung precariously in the balance. The precarious dance between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet continued. But the ground beneath them was growing increasingly unstable. The government, still clinging to the increasingly unpopular war effort, launched a major offensive in Galicia in July 1917. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to rally national spirit and solidify their authority. Instead, it ended in unmitigated disaster. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers perished, their lives sacrificed for a cause already lost in the hearts of the people. News of this devastating defeat ripped through Russia like wildfire, igniting widespread fury and despair. Protests, already a daily occurrence, exploded into a tidal wave of anger. In July 1917, armed crowds, driven by desperation and radicalized by Bolshevik agitators, flooded the streets, demanding an immediate end to the war and all power to the Soviets. Lenin, ever the pragmatist, recognized the danger. He feared the revolt was premature. His fears were tragically confirmed. The government, though weakened, still possessed enough force to act decisively. The crackdown was swift and brutal. The streets ran with blood. Bolshevik newspapers were shut down and their leaders arrested. Lenin was forced to flee once more, seeking refuge in Finland, disguised to avoid capture. Leon Trotsky, his eloquent and fiery lieutenant, was imprisoned. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the provisional government had regained control, but this momentary victory was an illusion. The instability of Russia's political landscape remained, only exacerbated by the crackdown. Shortly after, General Laver Kornilov, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, attempted his own military coup, marching his troops toward Petrograd with the intention of restoring order and quashing the Soviets entirely. His move, however, was spectacularly ill-conceived and poorly executed. The provisional government, paradoxically, found itself relying on the very Soviets it had just suppressed to defend the city. Bolsheviks, along with other revolutionary groups, organized the defense, sabotaged railway lines, and persuaded Kornilov's troops to desert. The coup attempt dissolved into ignominy. In its aftermath, the political winds shifted dramatically. The Bolsheviks, so recently persecuted, were now hailed by many as the true defenders of the revolution, the only force capable of resisting counter-revolutionary threats. Their popularity soared. Conversely, confidence in the provisional government, already fragile, shattered completely. Their inability to govern effectively, their failure in the war, and now their near overthrow by their own general, left them utterly discredited in the eyes of the masses. The political center had evaporated. As autumn's crisp, cold air began to sweep through the streets of Petrograd, a sense of foreboding settled over the city. Hunger continued its relentless march. Strikes paralyzed industries, and the very air seemed thick with whispered conspiracies. Lenin, watching from his hiding place in Finland, saw his opportunity. "History will not wait," he declared. He returned to Petrograd in disguise, his heart pounding with the conviction that the time for decisive action had arrived. The storm of October, a tempest that would redefine Russia and reshape the 20th century, was rapidly approaching. The crisp, cold nights of November by the Gregorian calendar, though it was October in the Julian calendar then used in Russia of 1917, held a breath of profound change, a tension almost palpable in the air. On November 6th and 7th, under the shroud of darkness and the cloak of calculated precision, the Bolshevik Red Guards, a disciplined and determined force, began their meticulously planned offensive. They moved through the city with surgical efficiency, seizing strategic strongholds, the bridges spanning the Neva, the vital railway stations, and the crucial telegraph offices, severing the government's lines of communication. Each seizure was executed with minimal bloodshed, a testament to their preparation and the provisional government's utter powerlessness. As dawn broke on November 7th, painting the sky with the cold, pale colors of a Russian morning, the climactic act unfolded. The Winter Palace, once again, found itself at the heart of the storm. This time, however, it was no longer a fortress of panic, but a besieged outpost of a dying regime. After a brief resistance, its defenses crumbled. The remaining ministers of the provisional government were arrested before the sun had fully climbed into the sky, their reign ending not with a bang, but with a whimper. The transfer of power was startlingly swift, almost bloodless in its initial stages. The Bolsheviks, a party that just months prior had been a fringe group, dismissed and ridiculed by their political opponents, now stood at the helm of an empire. The immense, sprawling land of Russia was theirs to command. Yet, this victory, seemingly so absolute, was built upon fragile foundations. The country they now controlled was not unified, but shattered, a mosaic of conflicting loyalties and desperate needs. The common enemy, the Tsar, was gone. But now a multitude of new adversaries emerged, monarchists dreaming of a return to the old order, liberals clinging to the promise of democracy, peasants who wanted land but not necessarily the strictures of Bolshevik rule, and a host of nationalists, asserting the ancient rights of their own peoples to self-determination. All these factions, diverse in their visions, but united in their opposition to the Bolshevik seizure of power, began to stir against the new regime. In the immediate aftermath, the centrifugal forces that had been building for months gained overwhelming momentum. New republics, long suppressed under imperial rule, swiftly declared their independence Finland, Ukraine, and the myriad peoples of the Caucasus began their own fragmented bids for autonomy. The empire, though now in Bolshevik hands, was fragmenting into countless pieces. Lenin, a man of ruthless conviction and unyielding pragmatism, wasted no time in consolidating his power and implementing the radical agenda he had so long championed. With a stroke of a pen, he abolished private land ownership, distributing it to the peasants. He nationalized all banks, bringing the levers of economic power firmly under state control. And, with chilling efficiency, he began to silence dissent. The vibrant, often chaotic revolutionary discourse was rapidly replaced by an imperative for obedience. To enforce this new order, a terrifying new institution, was born the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. This secret police force, wielded with a terrifying lack of restraint, marked the beginning of a brutal era. Russia, already scarred by war and revolution, now descended into an abyss of paranoia and vengeance. The quiet, surgical precision of the October takeover had merely been the prelude. The true, bloody horror of the Civil War had only just begun. As the dust settled from the October storm, a new, more profound and infinitely more brutal conflict began to coalesce. Russia, vast and ancient, found itself cleaved in two, its very soul ripped apart by internecine struggle. On one side stood the Reds, a diverse yet increasingly unified force under the banner of Bolshevism. They drew their strength from the urban workers, the radicalized soldiers, and the land-hungry poor, fighting with a fierce, often desperate conviction for peace and bread, for a future free from czarist oppression and capitalist exploitation. Their red star, a symbol of worldwide revolution, began to appear on banners and uniforms, a stark beacon in the turbulent landscape. Opposite them were the Whites, a coalition so broad and disparate that it was often its own undoing. This was not a monolithic army, but a gathering of all who opposed the Bolsheviks. It included staunch monarchists, old czarist officers, conservative landowners, and even some disillusioned liberals. They fought for the old Russia, a vision that meant different things to different factions, but which always stood in stark opposition to the Red Tide. Between these two colossal forces, a multitude of other players moved across the continent-sized chessboard of Russia, each with their own desperate agendas: anarchists, nationalists, the Czechoslovak legions, and, most ominously, a patchwork of foreign armies: Germany, Britain, America, Japan, each sent to protect their interests, or simply to take advantage of Russia's vulnerability. Every piece on this vast board, regardless of allegiance, bled. The scale of the conflict was immense, engulfing a territory stretching thousands of miles. In a move that shocked many, Lenin, seeing the war as an imperialist folly, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918. It was a humiliating peace, stripping Russia of a staggering 25% of its land, 40% of its population, and 75% of its industrial capacity. The sacrifice was immense, yet Lenin, with his unyielding logic, declared better to lose land than lose the revolution. He understood that the survival of the Bolshevik regime hinged on ending the war, no matter the cost in territory. Against this backdrop of a fractured nation and foreign intervention, the white generals marshaled their forces. Generals Kolchak, Denikin, Yudenich, and Wrangel. Names that would become synonymous with the white movement. Marched their armies under fading banners, each harboring a different vision of Russia's past and future. Their movements were often hindered by the unforgiving Russian landscape. Frozen rivers that became treacherous battlegrounds. Broken trains struggling along dilapidated tracks, and everywhere, the grim procession of endless funerals. Russia in 1918 was a landscape of desolation, hardship, and unimaginable suffering. The world watched, aghast and uncertain, as this brutal drama unfolded. The lines between villain and hero blurring into a tragic crimson haze. As the Civil War raged, devouring the very fabric of Russian society, the struggle for power descended into an abyss of brutality and moral compromise. Both sides, convinced of their righteousness, embraced terror as a legitimate weapon, unleashing a horrifying cycle of violence and revenge that would leave an indelible scar on the nation's soul. In the chilling summer of 1918, a particularly grim chapter unfolded. The Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and their loyal retainers, had been held captive in Ekaterinburg. As white forces advanced and threatened to liberate them, the Bolshevik leadership, fearing the rallying cry a living Tsar could provide to their enemies, issued a dreadful order. In the pre-dawn hours of July 17th, 1918, in the cold, damp cellar of the Ipatiev house, the entire family was brutally executed. This act, swift and absolute, was a symbolic severing of Russia's last thread to its imperial past, the final, tragic heartbeat of an empire. With the Tsar and his direct heirs gone, the white cause, though still fervent, lost a crucial unifying symbol. The violence escalated further. In August 1918, Lenin himself became a target. He survived an assassination attempt, though gravely wounded. This near-fatal incident served as the catalyst for the unleashing of what became known as the Red Terror. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, was given carte blanche to root out and eliminate all enemies of the revolution. Their methods were merciless. Suspects were arrested, interrogated, and often executed without trial. Summary executions became commonplace. It was during this period that the first concentration camps in Europe were established, not for ethnic cleansing, but for the internment and forced labor of perceived political enemies. The chilling precedent for future totalitarian regimes was set. Yet, the whites were no less culpable in their own brutal methods. The White Terror mirrored the atrocities of the Reds, often with equally devastating consequences. As white armies advanced, particularly in areas like Ukraine, they engaged in horrifying pogroms against Jewish communities, fueled by ancient prejudices. Mass shootings of suspected Bolshevik sympathizers and peasant rebels became routine. Entire villages, deemed to be supporting the Reds, were burned to the ground. The cycle of vengeance was self-perpetuating, each act of brutality by one side justifying an even greater atrocity by the other. In this horrifying maelstrom, ordinary people, caught between two merciless ideological machines, simply vanished. Thousands upon thousands disappeared into unmarked ditches, their only epitaph the grim, ironic phrase, "For revolution." No side emerged innocent from this crucible of blood. The initial ideals of justice and liberation were long forgotten. replaced by a cold, calculating resolve to win at any cost. Only the graves multiplied, silent witnesses to the unfolding horror. Foreign journalists, brave enough to venture into this nightmare, sent back dispatches that chilled the world. One observer famously wrote, "In Russia, morality froze before the bodies did." Both the Reds and the Whites claimed to be saving the nation, to be fighting for the true soul of Russia. Yet, in their relentless pursuit of victory, they both, paradoxically, tore it apart. The human cost was astronomical, the psychological damage incalculable. In such an environment, even silence became a crime. The very concept of history, as a record of human progress, seemed to tremble, shuddering under the weight of such unimaginable suffering. As the merciless struggle between red and white raged across the vastness of Russia, the nation's economy, already fractured and debilitated by years of war, spiraled into a catastrophic collapse. The intricate machinery of industry, once vibrant, now lay largely idle, its factories silent and rusting. The fertile fields, the very breadbasket of the nation, stood empty or poorly tilled. Currency became virtually worthless, replaced by a desperate system of barter, the specter of widespread starvation, never far from the Russian peasant's door, now loomed over everyone. In response to this existential crisis, and driven by a fervent, though ultimately disastrous, ideological conviction, Lenin launched a radical economic policy known as war communism. This was not a system designed for prosperity, but for survival, a brutal and centralized effort to feed the Red Army and the urban workers, no matter the cost to individual liberties or economic logic. Its tenets were stark and absolute total state control over all aspects of production and distribution. Factories were nationalized. Forced labor became widespread, and the most devastating aspect, grain requisitioning, saw armed detachments seizing all surplus grain from peasants, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. Resistance was met with swift and brutal force. Strikes were summarily banned. Food rations, meager and often inequitable, were enforced at gunpoint, while the economy plunged into disarray. Leon Trotsky, a man of extraordinary organizational genius and chilling resolve, undertook the monumental task of rebuilding the Red Army from a scattered collection of revolutionary militias. He forged a disciplined, formidable fighting force. His methods were draconian, iron discipline was enforced, and firing squads awaited deserters. In a pragmatic move, Trotsky even coerced thousands of old Tsarist officers, men of military experience but often politically suspect, back into service, placing them under the watchful eyes of loyal Bolshevik commissars. Their expertise was deemed essential. Across the vast, battle-scarred landscape, propaganda trains, emblazoned with red stars, crisscrossed the country. They brought not only supplies and soldiers, but also powerful messages, hammering home the Bolshevik narrative of struggle, sacrifice, and the glorious future of the revolution. Simultaneously, a concerted effort was made to dismantle the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church. Seen by the Bolsheviks as a reactionary force, churches were converted into warehouses, and priests began to disappear overnight, victims of the Cheka's relentless purges. Ideology, cold and unforgiving, replaced the ancient solace of faith. Fear, stark and ever-present, supplanted the rule of law, yet, through this very brutality, through the unimaginable suffering it inflicted. The Reds began, slowly and agonizingly, to prevail. Their centralized control, their ruthless determination, and the sheer force of their ideological conviction, however cruel, allowed them to mobilize resources and manpower in a way the disparate whites simply could not. Lenin, observing the grim necessities of power, was said to have whispered a chilling truth, a cynical reflection on the annals of history. History forgives only the victorious. The tide of the Russian Civil War, once a swirling maelstrom of uncertain outcomes, began, by 1919 and into 1920, to turn definitively against the White armies. Their geographic dispersal, their lack of a unified political program, and their often brutal treatment of local populations began to take their toll. The Red Army, forged in the crucible of war communism and under the iron will of Trotsky, slowly but inexorably pushed back. In the vast, desolate stretches of Siberia, Admiral Alexander Kolchak, who had proclaimed himself the supreme ruler of Russia, saw his anti-Bolshevik empire begin to unravel. His forces collapsed. Kolchak himself was captured and, in February 1920, in a chilling echo of the Tsar's fate, he was summarily shot by a Bolshevik firing squad. His death extinguished a major flame of the White resistance. To the south, General Anton Denikin's Volunteer Army, a formidable force that had once threatened Moscow's very gates, met a similar tragic end. After initial successes, his offensive stalled. His grand army dissolved in the ubiquitous mud and devastating sickness that characterized so much of the war. Retreating to Crimea, Denikin eventually resigned and went into exile. In the northwest, General Nikolai Yudenik launched a desperate, last-ditch effort to seize Petrograd. His army advanced close enough to hear the city's church bells. Yet, Trotsky organized a tenacious defense. Yudenik's assault faltered, and his forces were ultimately pushed back. Petrograd, the cradle of the revolution, remained firmly in Red hands. Amidst these grand military maneuvers, smaller but no less fierce, struggles flared. In Ukraine, a charismatic anarchist peasant leader named Nestor Makhno, often called the Black Father, created a unique, semi-autonomous anarchist territory. His Green Army, skilled in guerrilla warfare, fought both the Reds and the Whites. Paradoxically, Makhno often allied with the Reds against the greater threat of the Whites, proving instrumental in several key victories. However, once the White threat was largely contained, the Bolsheviks, who tolerated no independent power centers, turned their full might against him. Makhno's forces were eventually hunted down and scattered. Their dream of an anarchist utopia crushed by the Red machine. By 1920, with most of the major White armies defeated or in disarray, only one significant bastion of resistance remained: Crimea. Here, General Pyotr Wrangel, the Black Baron, a brilliant and determined officer, fortified the peninsula, hoping to establish a lasting anti-Bolshevik foothold. It was the last hope of the old world. For a time, Crimea held, but in a cruel twist of fate, a sudden, powerful storm created a passage through the shallow, marshy waters of the Sivash Lagoon, a natural barrier Wrangel had considered impenetrable. The Red Army launched a surprise invasion, overwhelmed. Wrangel's remaining forces were decimated. In November 1920, a vast exodus began. Approximately 150,000 soldiers and civilians, terrified of Bolshevik reprisal, fled by sea to Constantinople. For those who remained, a horrific wave of executions followed. The white banners, once proud symbols of a fading era, finally sank beneath the cold, indifferent waters of the Black Sea. The Russian Civil War concluded not with a decisive, triumphant victory, but with a profound, pervasive exhaustion, leaving a nation utterly ravaged and drained. Even as the major white armies crumbled, the vastness of Russia continued to simmer with desperate, localized rebellions. The policies of war communism, particularly the ruthless grain requisitions that had starved entire regions, had created a new enemy for the Bolsheviks, the very peasants whose support they had initially courted. Across Russia, green armies, bands of armed peasants, fiercely independent and driven by hunger and a desire for autonomy, rose up against the Red Army. These were not ideologues, but desperate people fighting for their lives. The Red Army, hardened by years of brutal warfare, crushed these rebellions with overwhelming force, employing artillery and even, in some chilling instances, poison gas against its own citizens. The countryside, already devastated, bled anew. In March 1921, a far more significant and symbolic rebellion erupted. The sailors of the Kronstadt naval base, once heralded as the pride and glory of the revolution, now disillusioned by the tyranny of war communism, rose in revolt. They demanded free elections and an end to Cheka repression. For Lenin, this was an unbearable betrayal. His response was immediate and merciless. No mercy. Trotsky personally oversaw the assault across the frozen Gulf of Finland, leading Red Army units against the former heroes. The rebellion was brutally crushed, marking a tragic turning point that demonstrated the Bolsheviks' absolute intolerance for any dissent. Compounding these internal struggles, a devastating famine swept across the land in 1921, exacerbated by years of war, agricultural collapse, and severe drought. Millions perished from starvation and disease. Images of corpses lining the railway tracks, of desperate families consuming bark and even human flesh, haunted the fragile peace that followed the major fighting. The scale of human suffering was almost incomprehensible. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Japanese, having intervened, continued to occupy parts of Siberia until 1922, a lingering reminder of foreign intrusion and Russia's vulnerability. Russia, by the winter of 1921, was silent, broken, and starving. The initial fervor of revolution had given way to a profound exhaustion. Lenin, ever the astute pragmatist, recognized that the country could not endure the rigidities of war communism any longer. To survive, to prevent the utter collapse of the revolution, he ordered a strategic retreat. In March 1921, he introduced the new economic policy, NEP. This was a temporary, pragmatic measure that allowed for a limited return to market capitalism. Grain requisitioning was replaced by a fixed tax, permitting peasants to sell their surplus. Small-scale private enterprise was again permitted. The NEP was a concession, a step back from the radical socialist ideals. But it saved the Soviet state from immediate economic collapse and provided a desperately needed breathing space. The revolution, in a sense, paused, but its innocence, its initial promises of an equitable, free society, was irrevocably gone. The brutal realities of power, the immense human cost, and the crushing of all dissent had demonstrated a terrifying truth: the dream of equality however noble in its conception, often ends precisely where fear begins. The groundwork for a new, autocratic future had been laid, shrouded in the quiet suffering of a weary nation. As the final, lingering embers of rebellion were extinguished, and the vast, wounded land of Russia began its slow, agonizing recovery from the cataclysm of civil war and famine, a new political entity, forged in fire and blood, prepared to step onto the world stage. On December 30th, 1922, a date etched into the annals of modern history, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was formally proclaimed. From the ashes of a fallen empire, a new empire, red in tooth and claw, rose cold, disciplined, and relentlessly determined. The human cost of its birth was staggering, almost beyond comprehension. 10 million lives had been extinguished during the preceding years of conflict, disease, and starvation. More than half of these were civilians, caught in the merciless crossfire of ideologies and brutal survival. For those who endured, for the millions who carried on, the scars were deeper than any ideological triumph or political doctrine. They were etched onto their very souls, a collective trauma that would resonate for generations, shaping the psyche of a nation. Peace of a kind did indeed return to Russia, but it was not the peace of joyful reconciliation or vibrant rebirth. It was the heavy, somber peace of utter exhaustion, a silence born of collective trauma and a profound weariness. The Cheka, the feared secret police, though renamed to the GPU, did not fade away. Instead, it became an even more integral and terrifying machinery of the state, its reach extending into every corner of society, its shadow lengthening over every citizen. Surveillance, repression, and the chilling absence of due process became embedded characteristics of this new political order, ensuring conformity through fear. In the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of the Kremlin, three shadows, colossal in their ambition and their impact, began to shape the destiny of this nascent century. Vladimir Lenin, the intellectual architect of the revolution, though increasingly frail, still held the ultimate authority, guiding the course of the young Soviet state. Leon Trotsky, the brilliant military strategist and orator, commanded immense power and respect, his fiery intellect a driving force behind many key decisions. And then, Joseph Stalin, a seemingly less prominent figure at this stage, but already a master of political maneuvering and bureaucratic control, was quietly consolidating his power behind the scenes, patiently laying the groundwork for his own terrifying ascent. These three men, each with their own vision and ruthless determination, would become the central figures in the unfolding drama of the Soviet century. The world watched, staring in a mixture of awe and dread at this new red colossus. Its sheer scale, its radical ideology, and the brutal efficiency with which it had forged itself from chaos sent ripples of both fear and inspiration across the globe. The guiding principle, often articulated by its architects, seemed chillingly simple. From chaos, order, from blood, power. And so, as the silent, cold grip of winter settled once more over the vast plains of Eurasia, the long, silent night of the Soviet century, with all its promises and its profound terrors, truly began.